Today on BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition, it's episode 9. Today it's a BRS160 update and answering that question, is a Triton Method a ULM approach? I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition. Tank Trials is all about taking everything the BRS team and the reefing community knows about a very specific approach to reefing, implementing that knowledge, tracking the progress, and exploring the results. This is week 9 of ULM and development of an ultra-low maintenance system. The goal is a show caliber, stable reef tank which requires as little maintenance as possible, potentially performing only a few minutes of maintenance a month. Today we're going to discuss if the BRS160 and the Triton Method is a working example of a ULM approach to reefing, as well as give a general overview of how the 160 is doing. I'm going on vacation this week, so at the end of today's episode, we're also going to share what you can expect to see, including a pretty awesome guest host. So starting with my own personal opinion, if Triton's a ULM approach to reefing, my answer to that is kind of. So I'll start by sharing the reason why I think that is, then share some reasons why it might not be considered a ULM. I'm going to start this off by saying the entire ULM series and approach was inspired by the Triton Method, but more specifically by their MACNA presentation on modern approaches to reef keeping. I absolutely took away some pretty critical concepts which eventually resulted in the ULM series. The first is absolutely that modern approach to reef keeping and the biology triangle. Being proper biology is simply the result of proper approaches to lighting, filtration, and chemistry. Put that way, it seems pretty simple, but application of that theory is actually much more complex. For example, apply your goals to this triangle and you'll likely output the form of success that you're looking for. If you asked me 15 years ago, I would tell you that I want to approach lighting, filtration, and chemistry with the easiest and most cost-effective approach possible. I certainly wasn't looking for the best available biology, just acceptable and affordable biology. Net result is on my first tank, I had a power compact fixture for lighting, a 90-gallon tank, no sump, cheap hang-on skimmer, hang-on fuge, and do-it-yourself maxi jets converted with plumbing fittings and 2 $5 radio control boat props. This was my approach to filtration. And my approach to chemistry was handled with some Mrs. Wages calcium hydroxide or kalkwasser in my ATO reservoir with a couple water changes a month. I upgraded later to technical grade bulk calcium chloride, which was acceptable to me at the time, and baked baking soda as 2-part. At the time, I thought it produced some pretty awesome results, so while I wasn't consciously thinking about the biology triangle at the time, my choices did achieve acceptable and affordable biology. This was my first tank, and that process worked for a few years. Where it fell apart is when life got in the way. I had a full-time job and a brand new business, which together was a 7-day-a-week job, with most days being 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. Ultimately, I didn't have time for water changes, and about a year after that, my acceptable and affordable biology failed because it was reliant on my time as a major component. Fast forward 15 years and now I approach my tanks very differently. First, with a decade and a half in the hobby, I think it's inevitable that the goal shifts from simply having a successful reef tank to a real hobby where you're both looking for anything ranging from better to best biology and at the same time avoiding the mistakes of the past. So in that spirit, more or less the ULM Tank Trial series is actually selecting ULM biology as the goal, which helps us select the lowest maintenance lighting, filtration, and chemistry solutions. The tank trial component lets us all actually see the results of that approach. So this is how Triton relates to the ULM approach to reef keeping for me. Not only is it attempting to reach for what they feel is the best approach to filtration and chemistry, but they're also applying modern reef keeping methods to biology which eliminate unnecessary maintenance tasks or at least attempts to reduce them. Meaning the requirement for water changes have been drastically reduced. Nutrient reduction is handled almost completely just by growing some algae in the fuge. They don't even want you to remove the algae frequently. The resulting very low phosphate and nitrate levels nearly eliminate the chances of common pest algae rapidly overtaking the tank. The 4-part chemistry solution is much more concentrated, which allows for smaller doses and less frequent changeouts, includes trace elements. Some of the harder elements to test for are sent out in vials and done for you, rather than performing 30-minute potassium tests most of us would never even consider doing. In the end, everything that you do with the Triton system is designed to match natural seawater and ocean biology. Everything you do in this system has a distinct purpose, and I think very likely the lowest maintenance method of maintaining natural seawater parameters. So these are the reasons why I wouldn't call it a ULM approach to reefing, starting with the Triton team never called it that, and this isn't their distinct goal. I believe their distinct goal is best biology with an attempt at finding the best approach to lighting, filtration, and water chemistry. However, best means a lot of different things to people in an ever-moving goal, so a better way to say it is they're attempting to achieve natural reef biology with an approach to filtration and chemistry that matches natural seawater as closely as possible. So within that, they do pay closer attention to chemistry, meaning they're testing and dosing trace elements that most reefers have never even considered before, with zinc, cobalt, molybdenum, meaning every few months you send in a water sample and they send you back a report of what you're either over on or deficient in, with a method of correcting that. Sometimes that means just a single, simple, one-dose correction. Other times it means adding an element to a more continual dosing because the tank and your specific corals seem to be consuming that element more rapidly than a standard set of tanks. In the end, the goal here isn't to play mad scientist, test every week, and dumping in bottles looking for some kind of perfect system. Just to periodically identify where your system may be straying pretty significantly from natural seawater and give you a chance to do something about it. Now, I will say this isn't an ultra low cost method of biology, and in a couple of ways more maintenance than some other simple methods, but it's not attempting to be either of those things. The goal really seems to be natural reef biology, and if they're not the best, they're certainly amongst the best solutions out there at achieving that. So in the end, if I had to answer if I would consider Triton a ULM approach to reefing, I would say it's absolutely way less maintenance than any other method that I've ever implemented. We've only done 2 small water changes in the last 6 months, as opposed to 24 in the 6 months prior. Testing is as simple as sending these vials in. Because we're a bit nerdy, we do take 5 minutes and send it in once a month. There are a couple of things that we dose outside of the normal 4 parts that's dosed every day via our dosing pumps. Really, the only thing that we have to do in this tank is put food in it every day, clean the glass and sand. So for me, I think it's absolutely fair to call Triton a ULM method of maintaining a reef tank. Okay, so beyond that, I would like to provide some key 160 updates. We're 6 months into using Triton Method on the 160, so if you watch the first update on the transition from the Zeovit system, you will note a handful of the corals did not like the system change for the first month or so. Oddly enough, it was the LPS corals and polyps that showed the most dissatisfaction with the change. However, at the 3-month update point, things were going pretty smoothly. Almost everyone will tell you that changing away from KZ will have challenges, but I think that's a mischaracterization. Drastically changing filtration and chemistry methods on any system will almost certainly add some stress to the tank. Because KZ does have some very effective but unique approaches to filtration and chemistry, the change probably should have been likely slower. More or less, we did everything in a single day. Fast forward to today and the tank is doing better than ever. The corals are not just thriving, but we're now having to prune them to prevent them from actually hitting each other. Some are nearly hitting the top of the water, and some of the encrusting corals are actually starting to grow over and around each other. I think everyone here is impressed by how awesome the system is working, particularly because it's so easy. Dumping the 10% water changes was certainly welcomed. Nutrients are still very low, and chemistry pretty closely matches natural seawater from our tests. The system is working so well, I can honestly say I'd see no reason to do those maintenance water changes, and if someone suggested that we start, I'd have to ask, what would that achieve? That said, we did see phosphate raise a bit, and the test report did tell us to do our first couple water changes. I'll start by sharing the PO4 elevation. That was 100% related to the fact that one of us must have bumped the intensity knob on the Kessel refugium lamp, which turned it off for a few weeks, which was pretty easy to do because we have this beast of a light set to its lowest possible setting. And because it's only on at night when no one is here, no one noticed. First lesson here is we would have known this happened if we had just turned on the Apex power notifications. The Apex would have identified that it should have been consuming power but wasn't and let us know. Here's the interesting part. Well, it was off, even though the tank gets fed a ridiculous amount of food, nitrates didn't go up in that time, but phosphates did. There's a lot of different conclusions you can come to on that front, but what I got out of it is at 2 years, the corals are actually the point where they're utilizing all the excess nitrogen themselves, but there is excess phosphorus. As soon as we turned the fuge light back on, the PO4 levels started to fall from their slightly elevated level. I think the experience correlates with many reefers' experiences where robust systems filled with larger growing coral colonies are their own nutrient control systems, and there's less reliance on filtration to achieve that goal as the system becomes more stable and robust. However, it didn't get there on its own. There will always be additional reliance on filtration in the beginning. So in this case, we're likely going to reduce the photo period in the fuge to reflect that. If you have the ability to reduce the intensity, that would be an option as well. In conjunction with that, I think we might add an auto feeder capable of adding some inexpensive particulate prey type foods for the corals throughout the day, attempting that natural low nutrient environment with continual sources of nutrient containing prey. We're going to explore a few different options throughout the next few months, and we'll likely have a permanent option by the next update. Moving on to our first couple water changes with the Triton system, while they don't require general maintenance water changes, you may need to perform them occasionally for specific purposes. In many cases, it's because an element has become elevated. If you're dosing that element, you can simply stop and let it go down on its own. If it's become elevated due to a different cause, then water changes are often the best option to reduce an element. In this case, tin was slightly elevated. They suggested that it could be from a trace element solution or a rusty screw or similar element in the system, as well as slightly high lithium, vanadium, and barium. In this case, I suggested a few 15% water changes. We fudged that a bit and did two 20% changes. At the end of the month, we set in a new test, and everything was back in order. So in the end, over 6 months, rather than doing 24 10% water changes, we've only performed two 20% changes, and I have to say, the tank has never looked better. I will share one bit of experience from my end. I personally wouldn't attempt to treat this as an exact science. The ICP testing is into the parts per billion on some elements, and that's difficult to do with complete accuracy. So I personally use the Triton ICP results as the best window that I've ever had into my tank's chemistry, but expecting absolute perfection is not realistic nor expected. I mean, I take too high or too low or very important recommendations seriously. However, the slightly low or slightly high or just important notifications I treat as warnings. Hey, you could keep an eye on this and look for trends. In that spirit, the elements that they suggest dosing, you can follow the exact amounts, or you can dose slightly less, keeping in mind that it's a lot easier to add elements than it is to remove them. In our system, we found that iodine will be near zero if we don't dose the suggested daily dose. Potassium, zinc, strontium also seem to be consumed slightly faster than your average tank. In any case, reading that dose page of the report is pretty darn interesting and gives you some pretty exacting advice for your tank. So one of the questions we get asked all the time is, do you like the KZ system or the Triton system better? I will say they're very different systems based on very different biological processes and equipment, but the results are very similar. However, the Triton is a lot easier. Other than feeding an occasional alkalinity test, there's really no daily tasks. Zeovit does have a handful of daily tasks. They don't need to be done every day without fail, and we never did them on the weekends, but there is a significant interaction with the tank. So if your goal is very limited maintenance or required interaction with the tank, Triton's an easy win. However, I don't think that's the end of the story. Because Triton requires so little work to be successful, I spend very little time with the tank. The 160 is just in a room that I don't spend a lot of time in. When we were running KZ, the first 10 minutes of every workday I got to spend with the tank. Not just performing a couple simple tasks, but the requirement to do those tasks also allowed me to take in a moment and enjoy the tank every morning. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, even though the KZ tank required more effort, I enjoyed owning that tank a lot more simply because it forced me to interact with the tank. So to answer the question of which one I like better, I guess I'd have to say the KZ tank just because I was a happier tank owner when I interacted with the tank more. I think this gets to the heart of why the ULM tanks I'm setting up are in my office, the one room that I spend more time in than any other. In this case, I am working, so low maintenance is not just a priority, it's mandatory. However, the tanks are sitting right in front of me all day long, so I do get to interact and enjoy them every day with zero effort. So if I was going to do this at home, I will always go out of my way to select some tank design that allows me to put the tank in rooms that our family spends most time in. And again, I would be looking for fairly low maintenance, at least a system which is designed to thrive when other aspects of my life take periodic priority. If the tank's going to be in a room that I don't spend as much time in, I think an automated KZ is a perfect solution that allows me to intentionally interact with the tank. So rather than a blanket statement of which one's better, I take the bits in there that have meaning to you and apply them to your own desires. I also note that we're 6 months into Triton. I think the year marker will be one of the most valuable touch points, and the 24 and 18 months being the markers of anticipated long-term success. Outside of that, in one of our last 160 updates, I noted that we changed over to Gyre powerheads with a custom program run on the Apex. I'm going to go on record here that this is absolutely my favorite flow solution I've ever implemented, not just the gyres, but how they interact with each other to create shifting, turbulent flow followed by strong alternating currents. Everything in the tank seems to have responded very well to the change. The goal is to simulate actual reef flow, which is very often a mix of strong currents with periods of turbulent flow. Most of the common settings on various reef tank pumps limit the options to on-off cycles in the seconds to couple minutes in an attempt to create varied or random flow. Neither of those things are my goal. It takes a lot longer than seconds to minutes to create actual sustained currents in the tank. In this case, we use 45-minute alternating ramp cycles, which starts with a 45-minute gyre flow from the right pump, which is a strong current. And then by slowly turning up the opposing left pump strength at the same time as turning down the right pump over 45 minutes, we create a slowly shifting point of turbulence in the tank that slowly hits almost every area of the tank with actual turbulence. Once the turbulence hits the other side, there's a 45-minute gyre or strong current going in the other direction, then shifting turbulence back to the other side where it repeats all day long. Everything in the tank not just seems to appreciate the strong currents and turbulent flow, but also periodic rest times of lower flow at various points in the cycle. Outside of that, I have to say the gyre ended up being one of the most attractive options, mostly because the pump is positioned so high that it's just barely noticeable, and while there is a cord in the tank, it isn't something that you're going to see because, again, it's mounted so close to the surface of the tank. If you'd like the code that we use for this or interested, I would check out that video labeled R2R fact number 6 at about the 8-minute mark, but we also put a direct link to that section of the video in the comments down below. I'll note that while the gyre pumps work particularly good at this, you don't need gyres to be able to implement flow patterns like this. With the WXM and the Apex, something very similar could be done with the Ecotech Vortex or even their anti-stick gyre mode, which would be fairly close. Using the VDM ports on an Apex, you could also use the Tunes DC pumps to create something very similar to this. The adjustable nozzles on the Tunes would be pretty attractive for many reefers. On one down note to this update, I will share that Aptasia did end up getting introduced to this tank. Even though we were meticulous with rock and coral addition, I'm pretty sure it came in on the Chaetomorpha we added to the sump, which is a disappointment. I think we may try to add some Bergia nudies and peppermint shrimp to combat them and keep them manageable. You might have noticed over the last few weeks that I've been hitting home pretty hard on using clean Chaeto, and this is why. Chaeto is really a potential risk for all kinds of potential pests. In fact, because it is a lit area of the tank, I'd say it's likely to contain any pest that's in the tank or system that it came from. So unless you know someone with a pest-free tank, I think places like Algae Barn are your best bets. I have mentioned them as an option and a few times in the last few weeks. They did provide the algae in pods for our tanks for free, but I have no affiliation with them. I just believe in what they're doing. I will say it isn't the cheapest option, and I do anticipate others coming into this market with some downward pressures on price. So that wraps up today, and I'm going on a vacation here with the family for a few weeks, but I do have some surprises for all of you. First, next week, Mr. Saltwater is going to join us here on BRStv and share not just what his thoughts are on ULMs, but also how he's helped his clients achieve that goal. I think it'll be very interesting to hear his take on what all this looks like. The week after that, we have something special with Richard Ross's MACNA presentation called The Right Kind of Lazy. He's not really speaking directly on ULMs, but I do think much of what he has to share is an approach to reefing that does reduce the demand on maintenance with a focus on what really matters. Again, a totally different perspective on what we've been talking about for the last few weeks. Then we're going to release our BRStv Investigates episode on do you really need to change out those T5 bulbs every 12 months? Does spectrum or PAR really change as much as you've been told? I think the findings will be pretty interesting. When I do get back, we're going to select our favorite ULM lighting options for all 3 tanks. So as always, if you like what we do, let us know with a quick thumbs up and hit that subscribe button because we release new reefing videos every week. I'll see you in a few weeks with that next episode of BRStv Tank Trials ULM Edition.